No, Tatiana, you invited me 20 years ago to come to Mexico, and you were even younger than now, and I was more or less your age. Yeah, more or less, yeah. And since then we are friends, and that's why I thought it's much nicer if we do a conversation rather than me writing a text about a person who's now an architect colleague, you know, and I think in a conversation we can be much more friendly with each other and express that, you know, our relationship is based on friendship. So I'm happy we can do this.
Well, I think that many things obviously have been very interesting about our relationship these 20 years. And maybe I could say that probably a lot in the personal level, but I think that in the professional level there was one key moment that I didn't realize then, and today that I was thinking on what we should speak about. I clearly think that marked many things that I do, which was once I was here to enjoy the opening of your exhibition at the Schaulager. And you introduced me to two of my colleagues of my generation, which was Manny and Simon. And you said that that you wanted us to meet because we were colleagues in the same generation, and they were here in Basel, I was in Mexico, but mainly because you were going to invite us to a project in China in the next couple of weeks, which it happened. We were invited to Jinhua. And then you said, I really think that in your case, you should start to make a network of people that you find interesting in other parts of the world, because you need to operate as a network, exactly the contrary of what we did as a generation. And I think if you don't operate as a network, you would not be successful or something. I don't remember the exact words, but that was the meaning of the sentence. And as I said, at that moment, I couldn't really understand, and I think none the three of us did. Then we were invited to China. We received this email from Fake Industries, which was like, who is these people telling us that we have to be in 2 days in China? And we thought, well, maybe this is what Jacques mentioned, and we were there. And suddenly, through the years, I have understood that right now in our generation, it's all about the architecture we can do and not about us being the architect, you know. It has this component of the importance of the space rather than the importance of the person behind. So operating as a network has allowed me to really create things that would not be easy to think as one person, but also not being able to be built as one person. Because I think that the moment where you operated and the moment where I am operating now is completely different, no? The world is totally another thing. And I also think that you started being very local in your city, where I started, my first project was in China, no? So that speaks completely clearly how we needed to become totally different operators in our generation, no?
I was also thinking that this aspect of group work, of collaborations, is one that struck me when I, as a preparation for this conversation, I was looking into your work that you sent me, and that I see many images where you are featured with architecture colleagues like Manny Christo, Simon Hartmann, and others that I also know from, because they have been teaching assistants in my studio Basel, for instance, like Manuel Herz or others. And I also think that this was a good point, that you should be trying to build such networks, not because I thought you couldn't work independently and as an architect, because you have proved the opposite. You have proved, and we will speak about that also, to do your own stuff. But I think it's good to work in groups, because I have done that with Pierre as a small group and with artist friends, Remy Zaug and Wei Wei especially, have accompanied us during many years. when I look at these photographs, I see that you appear in groups and that you, especially you, invite others to participate in this project for the pilgrimage route, for instance, after this Chinese example. And you've done other master plans where you invited people. Do you think that there's something in these groups that interests you, besides the fact that you are not exposed only as an individual architect, Tatiana Bilbao, as an individual with its own signature, but that because you select this or that person as a friend or as an architect, what is it that interests you in these other people? Or in other words, I think there's no theory behind it, but maybe I'm wrong. Could you say something about that?
Well, I totally believe that for me it's very difficult to see things that I cannot see. No, so you have a mind, you have a background, you filter your own ideas through what you have seen and what you have learned, but it's impossible for you to become another person to act differently. So I think that for me to work with someone else challenged me, my ideas, in a way that I cannot do it by myself. And I don't have a partner like you do with Pierre, but a partnership starts with that, no? Starts questioning your ideas, but also starts to also opening your mind towards others' ideas, which you probably cannot acquire by yourself. So I think that in the beginning, for me started like that I didn't have a partner, so I really needed that confrontation, which is very different. I always try to do it with my team, but at the end they're your employees, so at the end they respond to you and then they stop questioning at a point. So I needed that. So I started creating like a little network in the beginning, before even Jinhua, in my own hometown, with architects like Derek, my friend Derek Telecamp, or other Arturo Ortiz, or other friends that we shared ideas, interests, and we started working in things together. And then I saw that opening that network to people that I probably didn't knew as well, or they come from different cultures, would give me also more interesting challenges to approach and to expose my ideas with. And yeah, you're right. Like I always try to even invite people that I don't know very thoroughly, but I definitely always choose those that I admire their work by some ways. And I think that it has proven that it works in many environments, no? So it questions not only my ideas, but it also questions the project itself, the situation, and the way they approach the projects normally is totally different, obviously, because we're different individuals. And I think that also enriches the project, no? Because when there's way more complexity and definitions in one side, which it also happens in Lyon, for example, that you directed and I was participating, then it really provides a more broadened possibility for the people that is going to use finally the architecture.
I understand perfectly this idea of needing a dialogue partner to in order to go ahead and to find out actually what you want to do. But my question is heading towards something else. When I was a really young architect, 27, 26, I found myself in an architectural situation internationally which I didn't like, which was upcoming postmodernism and deconstructivism. And I did everything to find my own path. And we invented this word of minimalism, which later became a word that I hated, and we went away from this. But we clearly were digging out ways that can now be called or described in a kind of an ism, you know. And it was that time where something, it was like a fight, you know, and you had your friends who were part of the same kind of, let's say, attitude, not style, because we always rejected style. But now, your friends or your colleagues or the people that you like to work with, I don't see in your generation like these different battlefields. Or what do you think about that? Do you see different architectural attitudes which you like or less, or like less, or even hate, that you reject? Is this around also today?
Well, I do think that I come also from that battle. It was a different moment. In my case, it was a moment of blobs and blebs, and architecture done digitally with the software, and that's what I studied. And I struggled very much in the beginning of the years to understand that I didn't really needed to go that direction and doing architecture that was parametric, to use to use geometry as a tool. And I think that was what I think probably would relate me to the people that I work with. You know, I think that they were also growing in the same moment of digital architecture and trying to go away from that. So I think there is one battle of that, and I do. I'm in against that way of doing architecture, because I don't believe that really tackles the functionality issues that architecture should tackle, especially in a context where I live in. I mean, doing these crazy architectural jumps or somersaults that I called, it's unnecessary, because we really are in a context where there's basic necessities that haven't been fulfilled, which is really a refugee for living. And if you're thinking that, in the other hand, you can do a museum with these shapes, you know, then a lot of resources are missed to really go and do beautiful things, which you can do with minimal resources and not somersaults, not architectural somersaults.
So it's a kind of a position against eclectic, digital,
absolutely,
digital, stylish, or overly sculptural exhibitions. I quite understand that. So I think it opens up a door to, let's say, your work as an architect, that besides the fact that you have this interest in working in collaborations and collaborative projects, where nevertheless each architect has his or her own contribution, in the case of the pilgrimage, for instance, and also in the case of Lyon, which we initiated. So your work becomes visible, and Tatiana Bilbao has started, from my point of view, with a seminal work, which is the Botanical, which for me is a bit like the backbone or the central project, since you have been working on this for many years, and since you have been adding and still are adding pieces, and they all look different or have a different approach. Could you explain where you started and where you go, and what makes these different pieces different from each other, and what do you want to achieve with this project?
I think that it's because of time passing. You grow on time, and it's impossible to do the same things, no? Because you have learned things that are making you do different, operate differently. Although I think that we really are keeping the first strategy we decided to work with in the garden, which it proved to be very successful, which is understanding that the garden, it is a botanical garden and needs to remain as a botanical garden in its whole, and never anything that goes in needs to be claiming attention more than the botanical garden itself. So, and doing that, responding to that, we decided to break the program in the most divisible possible way, to make a little pavilion for each, you know. And then obviously for functional reasons, we had to relate some programs together, so they are physically almost together, but they're not one in the same building. So we kept that strategy, also using the idea of the expression as to be very honest. So have one structure that it's everything, it holds itself. So it's one structure that it's sustainable, structurally speaking, from itself, aesthetically, thermically, everything. So the material is everything. What you see is what it is. And these we have done in different ways because, as I said, like we have evolved as architects. So we use, for example, in the beginning, we were trying to search for these different types of geometry, mimicking nature or trying to understand where nature could teach us to explore these forms, and then more in more geometrical forms, using really geometry to allow us to define the spaces in a different way, but still the strategy remains the same, no? And I think that why it becomes seminal is because when you are working in a project that it's very small interventions, but it's very public, because this garden is visited by some 10,000 people or more every day. How do that architecture, responds to that intensity of use? Teaches you so many things that allows you to operate in other projects differently, no? So it's impossible to act again the same way. And but I think that also that learning process is very important for an architect, and the opportunity to do it in one project is very, very small. At least I don't have any other project that has allowed me to go do something, then reflect on it, see how it works, do it again, or do another intervention, and then another, and yet another, and now it's 15 years, no?
I see a tendency in your work towards more geometry. For instance, you start to use circles within Cartesian grids, and why are you all of a sudden more focused on geometry to organize your work? Is there a theoretical background to this, or is there a deeper intention, or where do you want to go with this?
So I realized that geometry was an excellent tool for me, because it was very easy to describe it to the people that build my architecture. And I understood this well. I was helping Gabriel Orozco to build his house, which is very geometric. And at that time, I was trying to explore these different possibilities of space with not described geometry. And I realized that it was very difficult to transmit this to the people that build our buildings. No, in my context, people have no training. Where people that build things everywhere in Mexico, people have no training. It's people that have just started. Probably the only job they can get is in the construction world. Normally, there's a big part of the population that it's analphabet, so they normally don't know how to read. I thought drawing was a universal tool of communication, but it proved wrong. In Mexico, they don't know how to read a plan or a drawing of any kind. So it's very difficult to explain to them how to build a wall that is not 90 degrees. Yeah. So in the beginning, that was the biggest, most important thing. I realized that was the reason that I needed to use geometry. But then I realized when I was working with that it proved to be a perfect tool, easy to communicate with others.
For yourself. For
myself also, to express. And then it proved to be a tool that would be able for me to transport into more complex situations, to then offer different types of spaces.
Of course, I understand. Geometry is an obvious tool for an architect, and is something that has been used for thousands of years. The question is only whether you continue to express this as almost a stylistic tool for architecture, or whether this is, and where exactly, because I think this is quite fascinating, this idea of using architecture as something that makes it easier to build it or to get it right, as opposed to geometry as something which has a certain, has an independent meaning in itself, because this is also a danger in geometry, in architecture. I find another project which is less based on geometry, but on the image, almost a dream, quite fascinating, which is the aquarium, which I like because you describe it as a situation like a petrification of something that has become visible after it was flooded and sunken in the ocean, in the water, that now is an object. And it's an object which doesn't want to be an object, something that we know from our own work, something that I like for the sake of being, or let's say for the reason that it avoids this fulfilling this idea of an aquarium, because what is an aquarium as a form, you know? And maybe you can explain a bit what the background of your thinking is for this quite fascinating idea of the ruin and of these walls which are evolving out into the landscape.
Well, I think I was obsessed with ruins since I was very, very little. I think this is how the first time I realized what architecture was, and I was 3 years old. And I think that since then I have thought a lot on the evolution of architecture, no? and how architecture remains way more than we remain in the time frame in life. And I think that therefore I'm always intrigued on how that architecture transforms itself to be another thing and to become a different thing. And normally it doesn't transform, it just is, no? A church remains 1,000 years and it's still a church, and it will, yes, transform the furniture and maybe the interior, and maybe it grows, and but it still remains as it is, no? So I was really interested in understanding if there was a building that could evolve with time as well, no? And how can it evolve? And I still think it's impossible, because it is. But this is why I thought in the aquarium, when they told me that they wanted an aquarium that looked like an aquarium, I thought, well, this is like the only thing that I don't know how it looks like, because it's a world that the man cannot access, no? In a way, it's this man control of the universe, and I love this painting of Diego Rivera, which is this man controlling everything. And this is how I see the aquarium. It's a world that we cannot access, so why don't we bring that world to us? So for me, that was kind of a hesitation when they asked us for the project. I was like, do we do this? Do we really encourage this? Well, first of all, in my mind, it solved when I understood it was more a center for research for the life of the Sea of Cortez. And second, when I thought that maybe why don't we create something that it was invaded by nature, and then nature was able to exist there. And this is why we created this object that was not anything, was probably a nice sculpture.
It also has a very romantic side. The ruin and the plants growing over is actually an idea of the 19th century, of German Romanticism.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You also do social housing, but also private homes. It's a wide span because on the one hand side is a social engagement for the poor. I mean, your country is affected by this division of the rich and the poor, and that is, of course, also expressed in architecture. As an architect, you depend on commissions that come from rich people. On the other hand, you invest some ideas in how people could live with who have less money. What do you think is possible in that domain of not so much the homes for the wealthy people, because this is a classical, almost traditional way to get a job, but what is possible on this in this field of social housing, of building for the underprivileged, etc.? Do you have a plan or a strategy, or do you have ideas how to support such a movement?
Well, the fact, I truly believe that we human beings differentiate from other animals because, first of all, we are human beings that think, and that through knowledge we acquire or we develop life, no? And I think that one of those things that add up is beauty. And I think all of us need beauty to evolve. And I think that all of us, everybody should have that opportunity. And in Mexico, housing is a human right. Not only a human right, it's a constitutional right. So the government has to provide housing. But they haven't provided that because for me, a house should be beautiful, should be a place to inspire your life. And so I decided that I wanted to operate in that sector because I think that architects were able to provide that into houses. And it's very easy to provide it when you have a lot of money. And you can learn the tools there. So I really like those opportunities of exploring how to produce beauty when you have a lot of resources. But and then to translate those strategies in when you don't have resources, what to do with the materials, the movements, the way you place things, the proportions that you have explored when you have a lot of money. When you don't have, how you can do it to create the same effect, and I think it is not so difficult. It's just a matter of thinking. No, it takes a lot of time to think and to be able to do it with very little money. But I proved it's right. No, and I think that that's what it moves me to do more and more in this sector, because I do believe that there is a lack of those opportunities for these people, because these people, they don't have beauty in their house, they don't have beauty in their schools, because the schools are also built just very simply and raw and horrible, I would say. They don't have beauty in their jobs, they don't have beauty in their lives, they're not able to go to museums, they don't have beauty. So I thought there was a really important necessity there, and
But you need a client for this.
Not always. You can operate by yourself, and I started doing it by myself as a research. Then I started being very political about it, so I started knocking doors in institutions that are the most important institutions that provide the housing for Mexicans, because, as I said, it's a constitutional right, so the government has a lot of institutions that are producing those houses. So I went knocking doors. Obviously, a lot of doors shut down the first time, but then a couple of them opened, and I started working first in the ideas behind how to produce massive housing that could be a place for people to really enhance their lives, instead of shoe boxes that are just piled up together. And then I started obviously to having more relationship with developers that were producing houses, and then I started to being commissioned to do those projects. It's not easy to operate because normally architecture is not considered, so they don't have a budget for an architect. And what it needs, as I said, it's time to think. This is what those operations needs, because the rest is there. And so sometimes it's not easy to get paid for that, but sometimes the government subsidize that pays, that part of thinking. Sometimes the developers that are more into understanding the necessity of doing that thinking, they would pay for it. And definitely it's not a place where you are able to stretch it a lot, because obviously you cannot be paid more than what a house costs. So, but I think that doing all the other work allows me to leave a moment for that, and for me it's very important. So the office really plays a big role, or a big part of the work of the office is doing that as part of research, as part of proposals, not solicited proposals, and as part of proposals that are paid.
I ask you because I found this ongoing problem, because already the generation before me, I saw the exhibition of Doshi, the Indian architect, who did quite a nice project, very large, because India has similar problematic conditions, where the architect just gave a kind of a raster, some kind of basics, and then the people did it themselves. In this I disagree. There is beauty if people build themselves. Even we analyzed we analyzed slums in Nairobi, in North Africa, and strangely, if people are given bricks or something, you know, some material, they can build themselves quite beautiful things. So I think that the role of the architect is actually quite difficult, you know. I think the role of the architect could be more in a kind of activism, and that was my question, whether you, especially I think in your country, I think is perhaps easier and more difficult at the same time than, for instance, in Switzerland, because there are no slums in Switzerland. But
I think that the issues that I completely agree with you, and I believe totally in these auto-constructed spaces. The problem for me is those spaces that the government builds as houses for these people, that they are being built to substitute those auto-built houses. And that is where the problem is, because there is where really nothing exists. They only do boxes that cost little money. But
I remember when I flew over Mexico, what struck me in terms of these slums is that the government traces some lines in their field, and along which then the people do themselves their homes, which is like a minimal intervention of geometry and infrastructure, which I think is quite a good concept. But I don't know exactly, maybe to hear your opinion about that.
It actually happens the opposite, because what it happens is that this land, especially around Mexico City, used to be agricultural land. So it's divided clearly in different owners, and this is why the geometry goes like that. And then these agriculture landowners would start selling pieces illegally. They shouldn't do that. And people would start building their houses informally in these plots. This is why it looks like it's very rigid, the grid. And then the government arrives, like the people settle. Normally it becomes a force of people that they know each other, so they become a group, a strong group of that they have power, because there are a lot of people. And then the government comes and intervenes and puts infrastructure in. So normally it needs to follow that logic, obviously, because those where the roads are, where normally the plots were divided or so. And then government starts to add infrastructure. And that's how it happened informally around the cities. But what the government is promoting, like an 11 million houses have been built in the past 10 years, which is a lot. So it's more than 1 million houses per year built by developers, subsidized by the government, that are doing these huge developments. Sometimes they're up to 60,000 houses per development in outskirts of city, because these developers buy land that is agricultural land, and then they change the land use, and then they build these houses. And that is what it's produced by the government to subsidize this informal way of living. And I believe that this informal way of living then provides way more richer life to those people than this formalized life. And this is where I tend to start to be very critical and to operate to provide better ideas for those.
What do you think architecture can do in the future in a society? What is the fate of architecture, and in which way could it support the society in the future? Because this question goes beyond my lifespan. I hope to continue some more years, but every generation, you know, has to raise that question, you know, since it's your business.
Well, I do believe that architecture right now for individual beings is super irrelevant. I think it's relevant when it comes to understanding or even reflecting history, and by the hand with power, then it really becomes what constructs our history. And then it's very relevant. But I do believe, and I really would like to see, that it becomes relevant for every person living in the planet. Meaning that we have a basic necessity of having a refugee, and we're not just animals that can have a cave as a refugee. We proved that wrong. We need a space that inspires us for our life, to be built on. So I think that we architects start to operate in that direction, and then maybe we would become relevant for each individual human being. And I would like to see architecture going that direction. I don't know what direction is going, but I would like to see it there.
I hear that, and I totally agree that to give people a decent home, each of us, wherever we live in this planet, is a serious goal. And I think it's nevertheless important that we have monuments which also structure the cities and ideally give access to education and things to everybody. But currently the situation doesn't look like this. I mean, there are many fields and energetic fields that seem to inspire other energies. The digital age, creates AI, and AI has an impact on all businesses and all professions. What do you think if one day, the doctors will be replaced perhaps by AI and lawyers, I don't know, maybe. What about architects?
I don't think so. We live in a physical space, and we will live ever in a physical space. We cannot live in a digital space. We cannot live in a box and then just have a digital life. We're social human beings as well. So I don't know. I like to think that we will not be subsidized by, like friendship would not be subsidized by a machine, and therefore we need spaces. So maybe architecture can be done digitally, but it will always be physical.
Yeah. That's perhaps one, because I'm asking that question to myself, because it's so rapidly changing everything. If you look at people in the street anywhere, their best friend is their mobile phone, and this is a virtual partner. And the question is, do we people, we humans, still have the norm, all the five senses? As long as you have the five senses, architecture plays a role. But if, let's say, you are substituting these five senses by some only visual thing, then architecture is lost in some way, And I think that what you said before, I can of course subscribe, the notion of beauty, that we have this kind of notion of archaic feelings as humans. But I'm not so sure. I see tendencies where this archaic condition, which is so necessary for architecture, is being substituted by something else. And I think that this could be an interesting battlefield, especially for your generation.
I think that we're specifically living in this moment where people are more and more going back to the archaic ways of doing things, people even trying to mimic the way in the 11th century people built, and or people that are going totally digital. I think there is a struggle in this moment. Where is this going? And we are like having this binary, or totally digital or totally not. People going organically, growing their own food, really building their own environment completely by themselves, or these people that are really like ordering everything by the mobile phones. So I wish that it again comes to a middle point where life is not one or the other.
But let's take a look closer. I'm just a bit polemic. Those who choose for the Middle Ages, the medieval thing, let's say we bake our bread, we do all these things, which people do already now, which is nice, but if they have 3D printers and they can print out their castle, their medieval castle or their cave in even very nice materials like wood or earth, then the architect has maybe a different role than now. Did you ever think of,
I think that
to inspire this, or to, let's say, to follow these processes? I don't see that anywhere. Perhaps because architects trust so much, they will always be needed.
I was always questioning how we could become this platform creators, no? So people can build their own lives. And I was thinking this in terms of acting in this auto-construction world, because especially when we started working with the reconstruction of the earthquake in these little towns, that normally all these houses fell because they didn't knew how to build secured spaces, structurally speaking. And we were trying to teach them how to do secure structures. I was thinking how we can become these possibilitators of each individual to build their own ideas and their own homes, no? And I think it's very easy to think in that system, no? But it becomes more complex when you think how that translates into the future. But I do believe that we have to understand how to become that tool maker in a way for people to do themselves their own
I think
places.
My question went into this direction because I think where we started the conversation with the group efforts and the collaborations, this is in some way an idea of platform, and your generation certainly is fitter for this than my generation, where we expressed individual works of beauty and monuments all over the place. Your generation, which works on platforms, could be really the way you survive such a tendency in architecture to print out works that are not inspired necessarily by the brain of the architect, but by the brain and the desires of the people.
Of the others, yes.